Hey everyone, we're coming back for another video today, and this is one that I am very close to, as are a lot of you, I'm sure. And today what we are covering is the topic of phobias. So as most of you know, a phobia is essentially a very, very deep, usually a logical fear of something. And almost everyone has a phobia of some kind, and some of the phobias out there can get pretty interesting. I don't want to call them weird necessarily, because they're still valid to whoever may have them. A couple of the more interesting phobias that I found when doing some research here, one of them is called ablutophobia, which is the fear of cleaning or bathing. That one could probably cause some problems for people, I'm sure. Another interesting one that I found is xanthophobia. I might not be saying that quite right, and that's the fear of the color yellow. So imagine being a young child and having to hop on the school bus to go to school, but you're petrified of the color yellow. I can only imagine what kind of problems that could cause if you had that at such a young age, to be honest. And the last really interesting one that I found that's kind of unique that I want to mention is called linonophobia, and that is the fear of string. I'm not quite sure how something like that could come about, but I imagine that certain people that could cause some real problems as well. Now, I personally have a phobia that I have to battle almost every single day, and I don't know what the actual term is for it, but I have a phobia that's pretty severe of bugs, insects, things like that. The worst ones for me are like moths or grasshoppers, because their movement is so irregular and you can't really predict if they're going to fly at you, so it's harder to avoid them. And that can be very troublesome when you live in the Midwest and have to walk your dog in the middle of the night and there's a light on the outside door of your apartment building. No joke, there's been times where I try to take my dog outside in the middle of the night to walk her, let her do her business, and as soon as we get to the door, I have to run through it, trying my hardest not to scream just because a moth flew at me. I know it's not logical, a moth is going to flutter me to death, but it's something that's, at this point, it's almost an instinctual response. It's something that I can't stop from happening. And I really would enjoy if I didn't have this issue. You know, I could go on picnics and not worry about whether or not a bug is going to crawl on the blanket that I'm sitting on. Or I could go camping. I've never been camping before because I'm just so petrified of bugs. But the methods of treatment are, which I'll touch on later, are a little bit beyond what I feel I would be ready for at this point. So we all know someone who has arachnophobia or a fear of spiders. Another common one is snakes, the dark, heights. Things like that are what are known as a specific phobia. And a specific phobia is kind of like the name says, it's a fear of something specific, such as spiders or snakes. Now, most of the time, people who have a specific phobia will be able to logically think out the fact that it's not logical to be as afraid of these things as they are. Some of them, yes, they are things that could legitimately cause harm to you, but more often than not, it's something that is, for the most part, harmless. And people with these phobias typically know that it's something harmless, but it's so ingrained in them that it's something they can't really just make it stop. Now, specific phobias are actually categorized as a type of anxiety disorder by the DSM, and it is becoming one of the most prevalent diagnosis, I guess, with almost 9% of people being affected by a specific phobia in their lifetime. And it's interesting because there's a lot of research that's been going on to try and figure out where phobia's reaction occurs in the brain. That sentence didn't make much sense, but we'll roll with it. And there's also been some interesting research done to try and figure out why phobias happen. Obviously, now some of them are going to stem from bad experiences. Maybe you were bitten by a dog at a young age and now you're terrified of dogs. That's something that makes sense. But for me, I've never really had any traumatic experiences that I could pin down with an insect. Ants don't cause you much harm unless they're the biting kind. Moths certainly aren't going to do anything that are going to make me have bodily damage. So I don't really know where that one came from. We may not know where all of these phobias come from, but we do have some ideas about ways that they can be caused. Again, one of the more common ones is trauma, but there's also been an interesting find that genetics may play a role as well. There has been shown that if, say, your mother, for example, has a phobia of spiders, you're more likely to have that same phobia on a genetic level. So in order to try to better understand how phobias appear in the brain, there have been psychologists that are studying using PET scans and fMRIs, which is a functional MRI, basically MRI on steroids, if you will, to see the circuitry in the brain and how it reacts and which pathways are activated when somebody is presented with their phobia. Sometimes it's just photos. Usually it's just photos. It's hard to fit an entire spider in an MRI machine without causing problems. But yeah, so they put people in these fMRIs or these PET scans and show them various images, some of which are fine, happy, whatever, not a big deal, and some of which are photos representing whatever that person's phobia may be. And they use this to compare the circuitry activated in the brain when something's considered not a threat and when something is a threat. One of the things that they found doing these various scans is that there's a structure in the brain called the amygdala, and the amygdala is a small almond-shaped piece of the brain that's between two of the temporal lobes. And they found that when presented with the pictures or whatever of the person's phobia, the amygdala is the section of the brain that is reacting most strongly. And they're believing that a malfunction in the amygdala could be what gives rise to some of these phobias. And they don't know why. They don't know what causes this malfunction. They haven't gotten quite that far just yet in their research. But this is more information than we've had in a long time. So it's really exciting to have this bit of information. The first step of knowing how to treat something is knowing how it works. So it's really good that we're starting to figure that out. Now, speaking of treating phobias, there's a few different methods that are used depending on who you see, what their specialty is in the world of psychology, or what they feel would be most effective for you. One of the methods is CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And CBT is essentially learning to recognize the thoughts and feelings that come with being presented with that trigger. So the spider, the moth, the snake, and logicking your way out of it, essentially. Realizing that, hey, I live in the Midwest. The majority of spiders that are in this area are harmless. So while it may be freaking me out, it's not likely to actually cause me any bodily harm. And this is something that can take a very long time to get down. It's not easy to essentially retrain the way that your brain responds to these things. So it's very difficult, but CBT is probably the more tame version of treatment when it comes to trying to overcome a phobia. The other method we can use to try and help a person overcome their phobia is a little more intense, to put it lightly, and that would be exposure therapy. Typically, exposure therapy starts minimal and works its way up. And on average, people who go through this type of, a way to help them deal with their emotions and their thought process, it usually takes about 10 weeks before they are able to sufficiently say that they are doing better. Now, exposure therapy is intense. I have tried going through it myself, and I didn't get very far. I was not mentally ready for it. Depending on the severity of someone's phobia, it will look a little bit different. But on average, the way it works is you might start by presenting someone with a photograph of whatever it is that they have a phobia of. So for me, it might be a very detailed photograph of some kind of insect, probably a moth, because that's the one that's worst for me and that's the one I encounter on a daily basis. Now, some people, a photograph of the thing doesn't bother them all that much, so you can skip that step. For someone like me, I remember being in the waiting room at a doctor's office once, flipping through a National Geographic to pass the time until they called my name back, and I flip a page and it's a close-up of some kind of insect, and I froze. It's so bad for me that I couldn't even touch the magazine to turn the page because I was just so frozen and repulsed by this photo. And that's pretty intense. So typically they will start with, here's a photo, let's talk about what you're feeling, what your thought process is, and figure out how we can work around that. Over time, the process does progress from things like looking at photos to things like maybe just sitting in the same room as the object. So say somebody has an issue with dogs or they're afraid of dogs, you might get a dog that's been very well trained, a service dog for example, and sit it on the far side of a room, and you sit on the other side of a room, and you start there, and eventually you move the dog closer until you get to the point where the dog is next to you. Eventually, you become immersed. Say you're afraid of spiders. They want you to hold a spider. They need you to know that I'm going to hold this spider and it's going to physically be on me and I'm going to be okay. It's not going to hurt me. And because of that, this is something that's very, very difficult, and you do have to be at a point where you want to make this change for yourself, or it's going to be way too much. It's going to be too much for you to handle if you're not ready. Now, for people who do have phobias, the good news is that there are treatment methods available to you now. There are a lot of people working on research to figure out the physiological basis of what happens when reacting to this phobia, and in doing so, once we unlock essentially what's going on in the brain, it's going to be much easier to find effective treatment methods. And whether that ends up being medication or different types of therapy, who knows? But eventually it is something that we will be able to handle in a much more effective manner than we're capable of now, which is good. I mean, that's the impressive thing about science and medicine and psychology, is that the more that we learn, the better we can help people. And I think that's part of what makes it so alluring to someone like me. So in the end, phobias are normal. A lot of people are affected by them, and they come in all shapes and sizes, from bugs to snakes to string. And we need to remember that it isn't something necessarily to be ashamed of. It's okay to have a phobia, to be afraid of something. That's part of what makes us human. Got a little deep there for a second. Sorry, it happens. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and sign off. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter if you're interested, at Kilatara1, and that's the number 1. And stay tuned for my next video. Videos go up every Friday. Leave a comment down below and tell me what your phobias are. Have you been through any of these types of therapies to try and help get rid of this phobia or help manage it? Let me know. I'm really interested to hear your stories about how you might have overcome something like this, because I know I haven't been able to yet myself. And as always, I'll see you next time. Bye.